Pick up almost any object within arm's reach right now. A pen. A phone. A bottle of water. Look at it for a moment. You know what it costs, roughly. You know what it does. But here is something you almost certainly have never thought about. That object contains, locked inside it, the condensed labor of human beings you will never meet. Time from their lives. Effort from their bodies. And somewhere in the chain between them making it and you holding it, a portion of that effort was captured by someone else, without those workers ever knowing exactly how much they gave, or where it went. This is not a conspiracy theory. It is a description of how the system you live inside actually works. And it was laid out with extraordinary precision and depth by a German philosopher and economist in the mid-19th century, a man who spent decades in libraries, living in poverty, studying the mechanics of capitalism with the obsessive rigor of a scientist dissecting an organism he had decided to understand completely. What he produced was one of the most demanding, most controversial, and most consequential works of analysis in the history of human thought. It has inspired revolutions. It has been banned by governments. It has been misread, misused, and misrepresented in almost every direction. And it remains, 150 years after its publication, one of the few books that gives you a genuine framework for understanding why wealth accumulates the way it does, why some people have so much and others so little, and whether that arrangement is natural or constructed. We are going to walk through its central ideas together. Not every technical detail, the full work runs to thousands of dense pages, but the core architecture of the argument. The concepts that, once you understand them, will change how you see a price tag, a paycheck, a corporation, and the world you move through every day. Let us begin where the analysis begins, with the most ordinary thing imaginable. Every economic system that involves trade rests on the concept of a commodity, something produced not for the maker's own use but for exchange. The shirt on your back is a commodity. So is the coffee in your cup, the software on your device, the electricity running through your walls. We are so surrounded by commodities that we have stopped seeing them as anything remarkable. But they are, on examination, deeply strange. Every commodity has two aspects that are completely different in kind. The first is its use value, what it does, what need it satisfies, what purpose it serves. A loaf of bread feeds you. A coat keeps you warm. A hammer drives nails. Use values are concrete, specific, sensory. They belong to the physical properties of the thing itself. The second aspect is exchange value, the ratio in which one commodity trades for another. 2 kilograms of wheat exchange for a certain quantity of iron. A coat exchanges for a certain number of coins. Exchange values are abstract, numerical, comparative. And here is what is puzzling about them: why do things with completely different use values exchange for each other at all? What do wheat and iron have in common that makes them comparable? The answer, pursued carefully, leads somewhere unexpected. Strip away everything specific about two commodities, their physical properties, their particular usefulness, their smell and texture and weight, and what remains? Only this, that both were produced by human labor. Both required time and effort from human beings to bring them into existence. And the labor theory of value proposes that it is this common substance, abstract human labor, measured in time, that underlies exchange value. But not just any labor. Not the inefficient fumbling of a slow worker or the genius speed of an exceptional one. What determines value is socially necessary labor time, the amount of time that production of a given thing requires under the normal conditions of a given society, using the average level of skill and technology that society has developed. If the average weaver can produce a meter of cloth in 2 hours, then a meter of cloth embodies 2 hours of socially necessary labor, regardless of whether any particular weaver took 3 hours or 1. This has an immediate and important implication. As technology improves, as productivity rises, the socially necessary labor time to produce things decreases, and so does their value. More goods can be produced with the same amount of labor. The productive capacity of society expands. This is progress, in the most concrete sense. But it also creates constant competitive pressure on producers to keep pace with or exceed the average, because falling behind means your goods embody more labor than the social average recognizes, and you cannot charge for the extra time you spent. Now we come to something that the commodity hides about itself. When you buy a loaf of bread, you see a price. You do not see the baker, the wheat farmer, the truck driver, the packaging worker, the fuel producer. You do not see the social relationships that produce this object, the labor divided among countless people, the coordination of effort across an entire economy. The commodity presents itself to you as a thing, with a price, as if its value were simply a property of itself, like its shape or color. This concealment is not accidental. It is the normal way that market economies present themselves. The relationships between people become relationships between things. What is really a social fact, that a certain amount of human labor was required, appears as a natural fact, like the weight of an object. And because we cannot see the human content of what we buy and sell, we cannot clearly see the social relations that produced it. This is why the most ordinary transaction, buying a cup of coffee, paying for a streaming subscription, involves a kind of mystification. We know the price. We do not see the labor, the power relations, or the social arrangement that produced both the thing and the price. To understand where profit comes from, we need to follow money through a particular circuit. Consider two different ways that money and commodities can circulate. In the first circuit, someone sells a commodity to get money, then uses that money to buy a different commodity. A farmer sells grain, gets cash, buys tools. The starting point is a commodity, the end point is a different commodity, and money is the means of getting from one to the other. The whole purpose is use value, getting something useful that you did not have. In the second circuit, someone starts with money, uses it to buy commodities, then sells those commodities for more money than they started with. The starting point is money, the end point is more money, and commodities are the means. The purpose is not use value but the expansion of value itself. This second circuit is the circuit of capital. And the question it immediately poses is, where does the additional money come from? If you buy something for 100 and sell it for 110, where did that extra 10 originate? It cannot simply come from buying cheap and selling dear in some systematic way, because every advantageous sale for one party involves an equal disadvantage for another. Across the economy as a whole, such transfers cancel out, they redistribute existing value without creating new value. The additional value must be created somewhere. It must be produced. And it is produced in a place that the circuit of market exchange obscures, the process of production itself. The key to unlocking this puzzle is a commodity unlike any other. It is a commodity whose use value is the capacity to produce value, in fact, to produce more value than it costs to purchase. This commodity is human labor power, the physical and mental capacity to work, which workers sell to employers in exchange for wages. Labor power is a commodity because it is bought and sold on a market. Like any commodity, it has a value, determined by the cost of reproducing it, meaning the food, shelter, clothing, healthcare, and education required to keep the worker alive, healthy, and able to work, and to raise the next generation of workers. This is what wages must cover at a minimum. But here is the crucial asymmetry. When an employer buys labor power for a day, they purchase the right to use that capacity for the entire day. And in the course of that day's work, a worker can produce far more value than the value of their own labor power, far more than their daily wage costs to reproduce. To make this concrete, suppose it takes 4 hours of work to produce the equivalent of a day's wage, to produce enough value to cover the worker's cost of subsistence. The worker has now reproduced the value of their labor power. But the working day is 8 hours, not 4. The worker continues working for 4 more hours. The value produced in those additional 4 hours goes not to the worker but to the employer. This is surplus value, value produced by workers over and above what they receive in wages. It is the source of profit, interest, and rent. It is the engine of capital accumulation. This is not presented as a moral accusation. The employer is not a villain in some personal sense. The worker sells their labor power voluntarily, they are not enslaved. But the worker also has no choice, in a structural sense, because they own no means of production. They cannot produce independently. they must sell their capacity to work to someone who owns the tools, the machines, the raw materials, the factory. The apparent freedom of the labor market, the worker freely choosing their employer, coexists with a deep structural compulsion: work for someone who owns capital, or do not eat. Once we understand surplus value, we can understand how capitalists increase it. There are two fundamentally different strategies. The first strategy is the most direct: extend the working day. If a worker produces the equivalent of their wage in 4 hours, then every additional hour beyond that generates surplus value. Work them 10 hours instead of 8, and you extract 6 hours of unpaid labor instead of 4. Work them 12 hours, and you extract 8. The longer the working day, the more surplus value is captured. The early history of industrial capitalism is in large part the history of this strategy being pushed to its logical and brutal extreme. Workers, including children, routinely worked 14, 15, 16 hours a day in factories and mines. The physical deterioration of workers was accepted as a cost of doing business. The logic was simple: the employer had purchased labor power for the day. It was rational to extract as much value from that purchase as possible. But this logic runs into two limits. The first is biological and physical. Human beings require rest, food, and recovery. A working day that destroys workers faster than they can be replaced is self-defeating even on purely economic terms. The second limit is social and political. Workers resist. They organize, strike, agitate for legislation. The standard working day that exists in most countries today, 8 hours, with legal protections, was not given by employers out of generosity. It was won through generations of labor struggle, against the continuous economic pressure to extend working hours. The second strategy for increasing surplus value is more subtle and more powerful in the long run. Instead of extending the working day, shorten the portion of the day in which the worker produces the equivalent of their own wages, and thereby automatically increase the portion that produces surplus value. How can this be done? If the value of labor power is determined by the cost of the goods workers need to survive, then reducing the cost of those goods reduces the value of labor power. And goods become cheaper when the productivity of the industries that make them increases. Technological improvements in agriculture, textile production, food processing, and other industries producing necessities can reduce the labor time required to produce workers' means of subsistence. When productivity increases in these sectors, the value of wage goods falls. The worker now needs fewer hours to produce the equivalent of their daily wage. If that equivalent previously required 4 hours, it might now require only 3. The working day remains 8 hours, but now 5 hours generate surplus value instead of 4, a full hour more, without extending the working day at all. This is the logic that drives capitalists to continuously revolutionize production, to invest in new technologies, to seek ever more efficient methods. Not primarily out of a desire to make things cheaper for consumers, though that is sometimes a consequence, but because each improvement in productivity that reduces the cost of necessities increases the proportion of the working day that generates surplus value. Machinery enters the picture here as a crucial instrument. A machine can do in minutes what took hours by hand. It can work without tiring, maintain consistent quality, and process materials on a scale impossible for human labor alone. When machines replace human workers or dramatically amplify what workers can produce, they transform the economics of an entire industry. But machinery has a specific relationship to value creation that requires careful attention. Machines do not create new value, they transfer their own value into the products they help produce, wearing out gradually as they are used. Only labor creates new value. This means that as capitalists invest more heavily in machinery relative to labor, replacing workers with machines, they are expanding the part of their investment that merely transfers existing value while potentially shrinking the part that produces new value. This creates pressures and contradictions in the system that emerge over time. When workers are displaced by machinery, they join what might be called a reserve pool of the unemployed, people seeking work but not finding it, or finding only precarious and poorly paid work. This pool is not an unfortunate side effect of progress that good policy could eliminate. It is a structural feature of how accumulation works. It serves a function: it depresses wages by creating competition among workers for available jobs. As long as there are many people willing to work for less, employed workers cannot easily demand more. Now consider what happens to the surplus value that capitalists capture. Some of it is consumed personally, spent on the capitalist's own lifestyle and comfort. But under competitive conditions, much of it must be reinvested. A capitalist who consumes their entire profit will fall behind competitors who reinvest theirs in new machinery, larger scale production, and greater efficiency. The competitive pressure of the market transforms profit into fuel for further accumulation. Surplus value becomes new capital. That capital generates more surplus value. That surplus value becomes yet more capital. The process is self-reinforcing and expansionary by its own internal logic. As capital accumulates, it also tends to concentrate. Larger firms, with greater resources, can invest in more productive technology, produce on a larger scale, survive downturns that destroy smaller competitors, and absorb or simply undercut those competitors until fewer and fewer hands control more and more of productive activity. This concentration is not the result of conspiracy or personal malice. It is the arithmetic of competitive accumulation. Capital attracts capital, success breeds scale, scale defeats smaller rivals. This tendency toward concentration sits alongside a widening gulf between those who own capital and those who own only their capacity to work. As the economy grows more productive and capital accumulates at one pole, the mass of working people may receive modestly higher wages in absolute terms. They can buy more, but their share of the total wealth being produced shrinks relative to what accumulates as capital. The rich get richer not despite economic growth but through it. Now we need to reckon with where all of this began. The story of capitalism's origins is often told as a tale of virtue and enterprise. The industrious saved, the clever innovated, the patient accumulated, and gradually the wealth of modern industrial society was built. The historical record tells a different story. For capitalism to function, two things must exist: a class of people who own the means of production, land, tools, machines, raw materials, and a class of people who own nothing but their capacity to work and must sell it. Neither of these classes existed naturally or arose peacefully. The creation of a laboring class required the violent dispossession of people who previously had access to means of supporting themselves. In England, the process of enclosure removed millions of peasants from common lands they had farmed for generations, driving them into cities where they had no choice but to seek wage labor. Those who resisted or became vagrants were dealt with through law and force. What had been common resources, land, forests, water, became private property. The displacement was not a transition from one form of freedom to another, it was the destruction of one way of life and the compulsion to enter another. The capital that funded early industrialization was itself accumulated through processes that were anything but gentle. Colonial extraction, the plunder of the Americas, the forced labor in mines and plantations, the seizure of resources from Africa and Asia, channeled enormous wealth into European hands. The slave trade financed significant portions of early industrial investment. Taxation and debt mechanisms extracted wealth from the poor and funneled it upward. Violence, legal and physical, was the instrument throughout. The pastoral origin story of capitalism, hard-working individuals quietly accumulating through virtue, is a myth. The actual history is one of expropriation, forced displacement, and systematic extraction. Understanding this matters because it reveals that the current distribution of ownership is not the natural result of merit and market efficiency. It is the legacy of a historical process, which means it is a human arrangement, not a natural law, and therefore subject to change. All of this analysis points toward a fundamental tension within capitalism that becomes more pronounced as the system matures. Production becomes increasingly social in character, thousands of interdependent workers, coordinated by complex supply chains, using shared infrastructure, collectively generate the output of a modern economy. No product is made by an individual, every product is the result of vast social cooperation. Yet the ownership of the means of production, and the appropriation of the surplus they generate, remains private and concentrated. A social process generates enormous wealth, a small class captures the fruits. the gap between the social character of production and the private character of appropriation widens as accumulation proceeds. This tension generates recurring crises, social conflicts, and political pressures that capitalism must continuously navigate. It generates the organized labor movement, the demand for regulation, the welfare state, the tax system, all attempts to manage or mitigate the contradictions that the system itself produces. None of these adjustments, however significant, resolves the underlying tension. They moderate it temporarily, in particular times and places, under particular balances of political force. What this analysis offers is not a simple prescription or a guaranteed prediction. It is something more valuable, a framework for seeing clearly. When you understand that the price of a commodity conceals the social relations of its production, you can ask better questions about those relations. When you understand that wages represent the cost of reproducing labor power rather than the full value that labor creates, you understand something important about whose interests are served by wage suppression. When you understand that profit has its origin in unpaid labor, the moral dimensions of the employer-employee relationship look different. The world you live in is not natural. It was built, through historical processes that were often violent, through legal arrangements that encode particular distributions of power, through ideological frameworks that present contingent arrangements as inevitable ones. Seeing this clearly does not tell you what to do. But it is the necessary starting point for thinking seriously about what kind of world is possible and what changes would be required to get there. That is, perhaps, the deepest purpose of this kind of analysis, not to provide answers, but to make the questions visible that are normally hidden inside the ordinary objects of daily life, in the commodity on the shelf, the paycheck at the end of the month, the price that seems like just a number until you ask what it conceals. There is one more dimension of this analysis worth dwelling on, because it touches something deeply personal, something about how we experience our own lives and work rather than simply the abstract structure of an economy. When a craftsman in an earlier era made a chair, he conceived it, planned it, shaped the wood with his hands, and presented a finished object to the world that was unmistakably his. From intention to completion, the work was unified and recognizable as an expression of his skill and imagination. The object bore the mark of its maker in a direct and visible way. Industrial capitalism transformed this relationship in a specific and consequential way. In the factory, work is divided into minute operations, each performed repetitively by a different worker. The person who tightens one bolt on an assembly line has no relationship to the finished product, cannot recognize their contribution in it, did not plan it, will never see most of the people whose partial labor combined with theirs to create it. The product confronts them as something alien, made by a process they participated in but did not control, sold in a market they do not direct, generating profit they do not receive. This is not merely an aesthetic complaint about the loss of craftsmanship. It describes a structural feature of how work is organized under capitalism that affects the psychology and the social experience of millions of people. Work becomes something done for wages, endured rather than expressed, a means to an end rather than an end in itself. The worker is present in the factory but absent from the product. Their labor has been purchased, the product of that labor belongs entirely to someone else. This estrangement extends beyond the immediate act of work. Workers are estranged from each other as well, because the labor market pits them in competition, for jobs, for wages, for advancement. The solidarity that might come from shared circumstance is constantly undermined by the structural incentive to compete. And workers are estranged from the larger social and economic forces that govern their lives, because those forces appear as market mechanisms, impersonal and objective, rather than as human arrangements that could be organized differently. This estrangement is not a psychological quirk or a cultural failure. It is built into the structure of how production is organized and how the products of labor are appropriated. Understanding this dimension of the analysis changes how we think about the pervasive sense of meaninglessness and dissatisfaction that characterizes so much of modern working life, the sense that work is something to be gotten through rather than something that expresses who you are, that the things you produce are not really yours, that the organization you work for pursues purposes you do not share. These feelings are not weaknesses or ingratitude. They are accurate perceptions of a structural reality. The wages system itself plays a particular ideological role in concealing what is actually happening. When a worker receives a paycheck, it appears to represent payment for their labor, for the time they worked. But we have seen that this is not quite right. The payment is for their labor power, not for their labor. It is the cost of reproducing their capacity to work, enough to live on, and not much more. The value actually created in the course of their work, which far exceeds the wage, belongs to the employer. Because the wage appears to cover all the hours worked, the unpaid portion, the surplus labor that generates profit, is invisible. There is no moment in the working day when the worker stops working for themselves and starts working for the employer. The whole day looks like paid labor. The extraction is hidden inside what appears to be a fair exchange. This is why workers who are genuinely working hard, genuinely contributing enormous value, can simultaneously be told that their wages are already what the market will bear, that they are being paid what their labor is worth, and this statement can seem plausible even though the entire profit of the enterprise, and the accumulated capital behind it, derives directly from the gap between what they produce and what they receive. The commodity form, money, wages, profit, each of these concepts, which seem at first glance to be simply descriptions of how things are, turn out on examination to be categories that obscure as much as they reveal. They present the results of a particular social and historical arrangement as natural features of economic reality. They make what is contingent appear necessary, what is constructed appear given. Seeing through these appearances does not mean that everything becomes simple. The complexity of a modern economy is real. The coordination problems that markets solve are genuine. The alternatives to existing arrangements involve their own difficulties and contradictions. The analysis we have been tracing is not a blueprint but a set of tools, tools for asking better questions, identifying where power actually resides, understanding whose interests are served by particular arrangements, and recognizing which aspects of the world we live in are truly fixed and which are merely presented that way. The question of whether a different arrangement is possible, one in which the social character of production is matched by social forms of ownership and democratic control, one in which the surplus generated by collective labor is directed toward collective needs rather than private accumulation, is a question that remains genuinely open. It is a question that different societies have answered differently, with varying success and failure, and that remains urgently relevant in a world where the concentration of wealth and power continues to intensify. What the analysis insists on is this: the world as it is was made by human beings, through specific historical processes, under specific power relations, and in the interest of specific groups. What human beings made, human beings can change. The first step toward changing it is seeing it clearly, seeing the labor in the commodity, the exploitation in the wage, the history in the ownership, and the power in the price. The next time you pick up an object and look at the price tag, you are holding, in your hands, the condensed labor of unknown people, organized through relations of ownership and exchange that were not inevitable, are not permanent, and did not have to be this way. That is where the analysis ends. And that, in a real sense, is where thinking seriously about the world you live in begins.